Have you ever wondered how the food molecules in the sandwich you just ate, or the water molecules in the water you just drank, are ever broken down by your cells to release energy? Well, to answer that question, we must delve into the fascinating world of transport across the cell membrane. And in this video, we're going to be doing exactly that. We'll get an overall understanding of the two types of transport across the cell membrane: passive diffusion and active transport. But first, before we get into that, it's important that we understand the nature of our cell membrane. Now, as we can see from this picture here, our cell looks just like this, and this membrane is this outer component that makes sure everything inside the cell stays inside the cell. But in truth, it's much bigger and much more complex than a simple line. The main component of a cell membrane is known as a phospholipid. And a phospholipid looks just like this. And in the cell membrane, we can see we have dozens and dozens and dozens of these phospholipids. A phospholipid is very unique because it is polar and nonpolar. One part of it has a charge and another doesn't. This area, this head right over here, has a charge. It's polar, whereas the fatty acid chains that make up the tail are nonpolar. And in biology, we call the head hydrophilic, meaning that it loves water. It's attracted to water because it's polar. And we call the tails hydrophobic, meaning that they're water-hating. They're nonpolar, and therefore they're not attracted to water. Now, this presents an interesting situation for a cell membrane. And why is that, you might ask? Well, the phospholipids make the interior of our cell membrane nonpolar, whereas the exterior of our cell membranes are polar. Now, let's imagine, for example, we have a carbon dioxide molecule that's trying to get out of the cell. We're probably exhaling carbon dioxide, and this is one of the molecules that we're exhaling. Carbon dioxide is a nonpolar molecule, so as it tries to diffuse out of the membrane, it can easily do so, and it's not going to have any problem in crossing the hydrophobic areas interior of the membrane. However, if we have a water molecule that tries to do the same thing, it's only really going to be able to get up until this hydrophilic area, and after that, it's not going to be able to cross the interior. Why is that? Because the interior is hydrophobic, and therefore the water molecule doesn't feel any charge or attractiveness, is not attracted to the interior, and therefore it's not really going to feel such an urge to cross the membrane. Now, this presents us with a sad situation. How are these polar ions, substances such as water molecules and polar ions, going to get across our cell membrane? Our body has created some solutions, and now that we've understood the nature of the cell membrane, let's go ahead and see how these polar molecules can actually be transported across the cell membrane. There are two main types of transport across the cell membrane: passive diffusion and active diffusion. And the difference between them both is that active transport requires energy, whereas passive diffusion doesn't. The main type of diffusion under passive diffusion is facilitated diffusion, which has two subdivisions. So let's start off with that. Now, the first subdivision of facilitated diffusion, which is basically diffusion across the cell membrane with the help of proteins, is channel protein. And channel proteins do just what their name implies. They open up a channel by which the molecule can diffuse into the cell. So let's pretend these orange molecules here are that same little water molecule that tried so desperately to get into our cell, but couldn't. However, with the help of a channel protein, it can. The channel protein provides a channel by which the water molecules can get into the cell. That's pretty easy. And in fact, water molecules have a channel all to themselves, and we call them aquaporins. Now let's take a look at carrier proteins. Carrier proteins do just as their name implies again. They carry the protein across from one side to the other. So let's pretend we have some sodium ions here that are trying to get across the cell membrane, but they can't because they're charged ions. What they're going to do is they're going to bind to this carrier protein, which is going to make the protein feel uncomfortable. And so the protein is going to change its shape, and it's going to flip upside down, and therefore the sodium ion is going to be facing the interior of the cell membrane of the cell, and is going to be able to disassociate from the carrier protein and go into the cell. And this process can happen vice versa as well. Molecules can be transported from the inside to the outside. However, now that we've covered the intricacies of facilitated diffusion, we see that we also have another type of diffusion, regular diffusion. And how is that possible? Well, you see, if we have extremely small ions or small particles, such as maybe a water molecule or that same sodium ion, if they're small enough, and even if they're polar, they're going to be able to cross the cell membrane just because they're so small. So they aren't going to be even needing the help of facilitated diffusion. But most of the times, they will be sticking to facilitated diffusion and will use proteins as their main way of getting across the cell membrane. So now that we've learned about passive diffusion, let's go on ahead and learn about active transport, the type of transport that requires energy. And as we can see from our diagram here, active transport has two subdivisions, primary transport and secondary transport. We'll start off with primary transport. In primary transport, energy is actively used by the cell to provide energy to move the molecules. And one famous example of this is the sodium-potassium pump, which is illustrated here. Now, in step 1, sodium ions, what basically the sodium-potassium pump does is pump sodium ions and potassium ions to different sides of the cell. Now, in the cell, usually there will be high levels of sodium ions outside the cell, and low numbers inside. Conversely, there will be a low amount of potassium ions outside the cell, but a lot inside. Now, the sodium-potassium pump is going to be pumping these ions against their concentration gradient. So, it's going to pump 3 sodium ions outside the cell. And how is this going to happen? Well, our 3 sodium ions are going to come and they're going to bind to the sodium-potassium pump, just like this. And then once that happens, an ATP molecule, and you can just think of this as a molecule which provides energy for this reaction to occur, is going to break down into ADP in a phosphate group, and this is going to release the energy required for the process. Now, once the ions have bonded to this molecule, the pump begins to feel uncomfortable and wiggly again, and so it's going to change its shape and flip upside down. And once that happens, it loses its affinity for the sodium ions, and the sodium ions are released outside the cell. Now, once this happens, the pump actually has an increased affinity for the potassium ions. And so the potassium ions are going to come and they're going to bind to the sodium-potassium pump. Once that happens, you guessed it, the protein's going to feel uncomfortable again, and it's going to change its shape. And when that happens, these potassium ions can now disassociate and go inside the cell. Once this happens, the whole process can start all over again, and by this time the pump will have increased its affinity for the sodium ions, and it can pick them up and transport them to the other side of the cell. Notice, because we're transporting these molecules against their concentration gradient, we need to use energy for this process to occur. And so now you know all about passive diffusion and active transport, and how the molecules in that Hershey bar you just ate enter into your cell